Hi.
Hey, Lahav. I'll introduce you for all the
Okay.
participants before we start. Let me check if we are up and running on Facebook as well. Yes, we are. All right. So I will introduce you shortly, and then I will happily give you the stage to talk about, well, the let's say eventful period in Israel now regarding Israeli politics. But first of all, for all the participants who don't know Lahav, Lahav is the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post, which is, of course, one of the most known Israeli news outlets. She has been very well known for years, giving lectures about Israeli politics and international relations. So I think this lecture is going to be very interesting. For all the participants, in your screen, you can see a Q&A button. Probably in Dutch, it will be F en A. So if you have any questions for Lahav regarding what she is saying, please type in your question so we can ask her at the end of her lecture. I think that's all for now. Please, Lahav, very welcome, and we're very thankful that you're willing to talk about Israeli politics now for CIDI, and the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. In my experience, Dutch people speak really good English, so I'm just going to talk freely. But if I'm talking too fast for people, just let me know right in the chat box and I'll try to slow down. In any case, so we have a new government in Israel. It was officially sworn in around a month ago. And as you may have read or heard, the most right-wing government in Israel's history. Back in 2015, after that election, when we had a new government, a lot of the media said most right-wing government in Israel's history. And at the time, I didn't agree. I thought that was false. This time, I think it's actually true. This is the first time in around 30 years that Israel has had a government that is just completely homogeneous on the right, without, say, one centrist party that to sort of balance it out a little bit. And I would say it's even more right-wing than back in 1992, because there's parties that are sort of very much on the far right, that were not necessarily, that were out of the mainstream for a long time in Israeli politics. So I'm going to get into what the makeup is of this government and some of the policies that they're promoting. So the main party in this coalition is, of course, the Likud party. They're the sort of main right-wing party in Israel, the major one. They're considered the moderate right, although they are a big enough party that there's a spectrum in terms of how, whether it's the sort of liberal right or the conservative right or even ultra conservative right. And they're all pretty hawkish. They're not really on a range of hawkish and dovishness, but I would say a range of how bullish they are, to use a different animal metaphor, on settlements and things like that. So there is a range in there with Likud. And of course, the leader of Likud is Netanyahu, who's the prime minister right now. And he may be the only person, well, there's probably a handful more, but one of the few people in this coalition who has publicly and openly supported a two-state solution. I know by reputation, one might not think that is so about Netanyahu, but it is true, and he has done it repeatedly. He did it in 2009 in what was his famous Bar Ilan speech, and he did it again in endorsing former US President Donald Trump's peace plan, which was a two-state solution. Again, if you read a lot of the news coverage, the international news coverage, you might not have known that, but Donald Trump did put out a plan that was for a two-state solution, even if people pretended it wasn't. So that's Likud. They're the sort of anchor of the coalition. It's a 64-seat coalition. Israel has, the Knesset has 120 seats, and they make up half of the coalition. The other parties in the coalition are all Orthodox parties. They're all religious Jewish religious parties. Two of them are Haredi parties, Haredi meaning ultra-Orthodox. And there's a Sephardic Haredi party and an Ashkenazi Haredi party. The Sephardic one's called Shas, the other one's called United Torah Judaism. They have chosen to divide themselves electorally in that way. The main political goals for them are basically to allow them to maintain their way of life with as much government support and funding as possible. So what does that mean? First of all, they want to continue to have an exemption from military service for full-time yeshiva students, which are most of the young men in these communities. It was once, like at the time of the establishment of the state of Israel and you know, the couple of decades after that, only the sort of highest level, smartest Torah, you know, scholars were full-time and would get the exemption, and others would still have to serve in the IDF. But over time, the numbers of yeshiva students just swelled, and this has become a political issue, sort of a political hot potato that gets passed from government to government. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that the situation is not you know, equal under law, and so governments have had to come up with all different legal solutions and tricks and ways to basically continue this situation in order to maintain their political coalitions. In recent years, the political coalitions were right-wing, and these Orthodox parties have only sat with the right. But that was not always the case. They used to be flexible and sit with the left, and the left maintained this situation as well. Other issues is they want funding for their schools and for their yeshivas. Yeshivas are one thing, right? You know, they're religious schools, but the elementary schools and high schools that are Haredi, they don't teach Israel's core curriculum. So, you know, math, English, science, they don't really teach English and science at all, and math only at a very low level, and yet they get state funding. So that's like another controversial political issue. Also, just housing issues are important to them. Welfare is important to them. So those are a lot of the issues that they're very focused on. And then when it comes to religion and state in Israel, you know, in Israel, you have freedom of religion, but you don't have separation of religion and state. So that means that the state funds religious services for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But for Jews, it's Orthodox, and over the years, it became more and more strictly Orthodox, more and more Haredi. And they want to maintain that. They want to completely maintain the religious status quo in Israel, which brings up all kinds of issues of, you know, who can certify things to be kosher, what kinds of synagogues get state funding. So they're very involved in those issues. Now, the leader of Shas, the second, the Sephardic Haredi party, is Aryeh Deri. You might have heard of Aryeh Deri because he's very corrupt and has been convicted more than once in Israel's courts. So first he was convicted in the 1990s, and he actually ended up going to prison. But Israel allows someone 7 years after they leave prison to return to politics. And so he made a return in the 2013 election, I believe it was, and has been in politics ever since. But then last year, and back then it was a conviction for bribery. This time, last year, he was convicted of tax evasion. So he like fraudulently sold a second home to his brother. So it's like his home, but it's listed as his brother's. He didn't pay taxes on it. And he was convicted in court. And as part of his plea deal, in order not to serve prison time, and he had a suspended sentence, he quit the Knesset. And his lawyer made a statement that he's leaving public life and turning to private life. And then 10 months later, he was running in the election. Sorry about that. And 10 months later, he was running there was an election, and he was elected back into the Knesset. And the fact that he ran at all, you say contradicts what his lawyer said. So just last week, so he was head of the parties in the Knesset, excuse me. And he was appointed minister. He's one of Netanyahu's sort of long-standing political allies. And he was Interior Minister and Health Minister for the past month. And people complained to the court about this. They said, he was convicted of a crime. He left politics ostensibly because he was convicted of the crime. How is he a minister again? And the court took the side of the complainants. They said that Deri has to resign or be fired from the government. So just yesterday, Netanyahu fired him. He didn't want to resign, so Netanyahu fired him. I mean, it was a formality, right? But and so now he's no longer a minister, but he's still a politically important person. He's still the head of the party. He still is sort of directing the policy. And the coalition is going to try to look for some way to pass a law, to change the law in order to allow him to become minister again. Now, all of this is connected to judicial reform, which is something that you may have heard about if you've been reading, about Israeli politics in the past month or so, and I'm going to get to that. But just this is specific to Shas, and I'm going party by party, so excuse me, sorry about that. The next party in the coalition, and the final party, is called the Religious Zionist Party, and they're actually a block of 3 different parties. The 2 main ones one is called the Religious Zionist Party, and the other one is called Otzma Yehudit, which means Jewish power. The Religious Zionist Party is what was once known as the National Religious Party or Bayit Yehudi, but sort of. So those parties were, at least in recent decades, considered the far right, but not extremists. They were like to the right of Likud. That party split up over our ongoing 4-year political crisis now, which, if I were to get into the roots of that and how that went, that would be a whole other hour of speaking. So I'm leaving that background aside. But over the course of that crisis, what was once known as the Bayit Yehudi party, they split up to the more moderate side and the more extreme side. And the more moderate side, briefly, one became prime minister, Naftali Bennett, but then disappeared in this election. They didn't pass the political threshold, what was left of that part of the party. And the more extreme end of the party is now the Religious Zionist Party, led by someone named Bezalel Smotrich. Very socially conservative, very focused on settlement issues. Then the other segment of the Religious Zionist Party is Otzma Yehudit. He's led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir is someone who considered himself a student of Rabbi Meir Kahane. Rabbi Meir Kahane was the extremist rabbi. He moved from America to Israel. He promoted basically deporting Arabs from Israel or paying them to leave. Different times in his thinking. Sometimes he wanted them to be forced out. Sometimes he wanted them to be paid to leave. But in general, and he was for a Jewish theocracy in Israel. Ben-Gvir is too young to have actually studied from this. And the other important thing to know about Rabbi Meir Kahane is that he served in the Knesset for 1 term. And then the Knesset passed a law that if you incite to racism, you can't run for Knesset. And so he could no longer be a Knesset member after that 1 term. And Ben-Gvir is too young to have actually been Rabbi Kahane's student. Rabbi Kahane was assassinated by a Palestinian in the early 90s. But he, sort of has associated with students of Rabbi Meir Kahane in Israel. He became a very well-known sort of extremist, anti-Arab activist in the Hebron area, starting in the 1990s, really when he was a teenager. Now he says that he doesn't promote or follow sort of Kahane 100%. So he doesn't talk about, but it's he doesn't follow it 100%, but he's still very close in a lot of ways. So he doesn't talk about a theocracy. he does talk about a remaining democracy, but at least as he sees democracy to be. But he still talks about, for example, deporting Arabs. He says deporting terrorists, supporting those who don't support the state of Israel, not all Arabs. But of course, well, what is his standard for what is a terrorist or an Arab who doesn't support the state of Israel? That's the question. He doesn't clarify that much. And another thing that came up, which again, it's not something illegal, but it's symbolic in a sense, is that apparently he had a picture in his house of Baruch Goldstein. Baruch Goldstein was Jewish resident of Hebron who went into the tomb of the patriarchs and started shooting at Arabs praying there. This was in the 1990s. And Ben-Gvir honored this person with a picture in his house. So people often bring that up to point to how extreme Ben-Gvir's views are. Ben-Gvir is now he changed the name of the ministry to the Minister of National Security, but essentially it means that he's in charge of police. Now, Ben-Gvir was somebody who a few years ago, his party wouldn't have even passed the threshold and gotten into the Knesset. But he slowly grew in popularity and then really spiked after the Gaza war of 2021, Operation Guardian of the Wall. And the reason for that is, unlike the many other rounds of fighting between Gaza and Israel, in this case, the fighting spread within Israel, and in mixed Arab Jewish cities within Israel, there was violence. There were attacks by Arabs, burning down synagogues, burning down Jewish businesses, attempted lynchings of Jews, pulling people out of their cars at red lights and beating them within an inch of their lives. And there were Jews who fought back as well. But it was a really traumatic experience for a lot of people. It was something that they hadn't experienced. It was something that's not common, certainly on that side of the green line, but overall, not something most Israelis experience, Jews or Arabs. And a lot of people were really shaken by it. And Ben-Gvir was really on that issue and saying that the law enforcement has to be better. And he really grew in popularity following those events. And so he decided to become the minister that's in charge of police, to, building on what he had campaigned on, greater sort of personal security, rule of law, things like that. So those are the parties in the coalition. The big issue that's being discussed right now in Israel is the proposed judicial reform by this government. So Israel does not have a constitution. I do not remember if the Netherlands has a constitution or not, but most democratic countries do, and probably a lot of non-democratic ones as well. But in any case, Israel is built on the British model. The UK does not have a constitution either. But in the early 1990s, the Knesset passed two laws that were about individual rights. And the court determined, excuse me again, sorry about this, a little bit of a cold. The court determined that any new laws that were passed that contradicted those laws pertaining to individual rights could be struck down. Now, there was no law passed that changed the way the judiciary works in Israel. This was something that the judiciary decided and started doing. And then, of course, once the legal precedent was set, it was something that the Supreme Court did repeatedly. In the past decade or so, a little over a decade at this point, it started doing it a lot more frequently as well. So this is what Israelis call judicial activism. There's another sort of part to judicial activism, which is that, there are things that the government does, policies that it sets that aren't necessarily laws that are passed, right? It's a minister makes a decision, and the court has also adjudicates sort of and makes rulings on those kinds of decisions and has a criteria of whether things are reasonable or not. So it's not whether it violates the law, it's whether the panel of judges sees it as something that's reasonable or not. And reasonable, of course, is subjective. So these two sort of elements of judicial activism are things that over the years, the Israeli right has come to really oppose, but even in certain cases, the Israeli left sees it as overreach, I would call it judicial overreach. Now, another element with the courts in Israel that the judicial reform seeks to change is how judges are selected. So in Israel, there's a committee of 9 members that selects new judges and also selects the Supreme Court justices and the president of the Supreme Court. And the judges, current Supreme Court judges who are on the committee, basically have the decisive votes. What they think, in terms of the candidates to be judges, is generally what goes. There have been cases. It's because also the Bar Association has seats on this committee, and the courts have a huge influence. The judges have a huge influence on the Bar Association representatives who want to be judges one day. And therefore, basically, you have activist judges who nominate or who vote for new activist judges. The judges sort of appoint themselves, and in most cases make sure that their sort of philosophy of how the judiciary should work is perpetuated. And so the judicial reform also seeks to change that and but part of the issue with the judicial reform is that it makes a lot of changes, right? It wants to make it almost impossible for the court to overturn laws passed by the Knesset. And if they still manage to overturn a law, they want to allow the Knesset to repass those laws. Which the thing of repassing a law that the court overturned is something that they took from Canada, but in Canada, it's very, very rarely used. Whereas right now in Israel, the coalition's already talking about which laws they're going to try to overturn. And they want to make the reasonability or reasonableness test against the law, that the court can't do that. They want to change the committee so that the politicians are the ones who have the decisive votes. They wanted to add more political figures to the committee. There's a question here. There's very little disagreement in Israeli politics that there probably should be some kind of law passed or some kind of reform and how the Knesset and the judiciary work. It's very clear that this sort of ad hoc situation has created a lot of tension and in some ways has delegitimized courts in the eyes of the public. I mean, it depends who in the public, but overall, it's this situation that sort of there's never been like an official guideline of how these two powers of government keep each other in check. But the question is what to do, right? So the left, the opposition, which is the center and the left in Israel, they believe that the judicial reform proposed by this government is going too far in the other direction, right? That they are, rather than having a super powerful court, which Israel has now, it would make the politicians have a lot of power, or too much power over the courts. So it's an overcorrection. This is, of course, a matter of opinion. Opinions differ, but I would say there are some on the moderate right as well who feel that way, that it's an overcorrection. And these protests, which you may have heard that there have been protests in Tel Aviv every weekend for the past few weeks, they've come to focus, at least the last couple of weeks, really on this judicial issue. With Deri, the majority of the judges that said that Deri had to resign and could no longer serve as a minister cited the reasonableness test. Now, a bunch of them cited the fact that he lied to the court, which is a different issue, right? It's not the reasonable time. It's something there in the law that, he lied in the terms, or at least his lawyer lied in the terms of his plea bargain, right? And if the judges were politically savvy, I think they would have relied on that, on him or his lawyer lying in the plea bargain rather than the reasonable test. So one could see that as them doing, there's a Hebrew word called dafka, like they were sort of doing it on purpose, the reasonableness test, to say to the politicians, like, we can still do this is legitimate. They certainly took it that way, and so now the coalition is looking for ways to change the law so that Deri can be a minister again. So there's huge political protests. People are saying that the judicial reform will undermine democracy. And I don't share that opinion that it's not going to be democratic, but I think, there's room, whenever there's a law, right? There's a reason that it goes through an entire process in the Knesset. In Israel, you have 3 votes, and in between each round of voting, there's a committee meeting, and the committees discuss it, and they make changes to the original draft. And I mean, like any serious parliament. And so, in theory, this law should go through that process. The issue right now, I think, is that, I mean, aside from any issues with the actual content of the law, is that the opposition is out leading these protests on the streets every Saturday night, and they are boycotting the legislative committees. So, in my opinion, which I have shared on Twitter, but my opinion is that they're sort of giving up the fight. Protests are an important part of a democracy for the public to express their opinions, but for the opposition not to show up in the committees. And, if they think that this is such a crisis of democracy, they should be there making practical proposals to make changes in the bill. But they're not there, and I think that's a dereliction of duty. And I hope that they start showing up soon, just because that's how things should work in a democracy, where you hear multiple opinions and then they work things out to something in the middle. It might be in the middle, closer to the right and not the left, but it would still, them being there could change things. So we'll see what happens with that going forward. In the meantime, we have this protest movement. Now, there are other things that they are protesting. There are there's an interesting sort of dynamic in this coalition when it comes to gay people and gay rights. So the Speaker of the Knesset, which Netanyahu appointed from his Likud party, is gay. He's the first gay Speaker of the Knesset. One of the first out gay ministers in Israel, maybe the 3rd or 4th. And when he became Speaker and he gave a speech, thanking the Knesset for voting him in and everything, and he thanked his husband, and his children were there as well. And some of the ultra-Orthodox members of the coalition felt very uncomfortable about this. And there's also, I had said the Religious Zionist Party is made up of 3 parties, and I only described 2 of them. So one of the parties in that block only has 1 seat, so I didn't get into it too much, but in this context I will. They're called the Noam Party. They're an Orthodox party, and they campaigned in favor of the normal family. So by normal family, they mean not gay. And they sort of believe that there is like a gay agenda in the media, and that's being promoted in Israeli education, and they oppose that. They only have 1 Knesset member. He's not, unfortunately, not the first and not the last homophobe in the Knesset. And so I try to fixate on it too much, but you probably have heard about him in the media. So that is why I am mentioning him. Netanyahu has promised that he's not going to allow any changes or any rolling back of gay rights. And it's sort of hard to see how one person would make any of that happen anyway. He really doesn't have the power. That's not to say that there aren't other Knesset members who, are maybe not so happy with the positive gay rights that Israel has. But there's really only one person who was so fixated on it. And interestingly, the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, are not fixated on it at all. It's the opposite. They feel like the more people talk about it, the more people call attention to it. They don't want their communities to think or know about it too much. That's a different form of homophobia, I suppose. When it comes to Palestinian issues, settlement issues, the issue right now that's sort of on the agenda that's in the news is last week, some people, yes.
Lahav,
yeah.
Could we...
You want me to stop for questions?
No, could we take another 10 minutes approximately? So in the end, we'll have 15, 20 minutes for some questions. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Maybe even just 5 minutes.
Okay.
I think this is my last topic, so we'll see how long it takes.
All right. Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great. So last week, some people built what's called an outpost. An outpost, there's all these words about what's happening in, speaking of all these words, West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria is, of course, the historic term. West Bank is probably what you hear more in the media. So you have what people call settlements, and those are like established towns or cities. And then you have what are called, some of them are small, like villages. But then you have what are called outposts, and outposts are usually when people put a few caravans on the top of the hill, give it a name, and say, we live here now. Now, in some cases, they do it on land that's sort of controlled by the IDF, and so they find ways to legalize it. But in general, outposts start out not being legal, not being planned or approved by the government, and then if they're able to sort of retrofit it and get permission, then they can stay, and often they're very close to existing settlements, and they become like a neighborhood in an existing settlement. In this case, somebody built an outpost, a few people built an outpost on Thursday night, and on Friday morning, and these, Israeli Jews did it. On Friday morning, the Israeli army took it down. They said, it's illegal. We didn't give you any permission to do this. We don't want you here. This has caused tension within the coalition. So again, these people are breaking the law. They're breaking Israel's law. It's not like when foreign governments come and say settlements break international law. This is like the law of Israel they've broken. But the Religious Zionist Party does not want these outposts to be taken down. They are all for it. And also Bezalel Smotrich, the head of the Religious Zionist Party, he was supposed to be given authority that was once under the defense ministry over sort of the way settlements are treated by the army. And there's like an argument over who has the authority to give this order, whether to demolish the outpost or not, whether it's the defense minister or Smotrich. I'm not going to get into the sort of details of that. It's something that I also think is still being worked out within the coalition. But there's anger and tension in the coalition right now over that. Now, there's also a lot of illegal Palestinian construction in what's called Area C, which are the areas of the West Bank that are administered by Israel. And so when Palestinians build there, they also need permits from Israel. That's not in what are called areas A and B, which are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. They don't need Israel's permission. And so one of the things that this government or that members of this government have done is to say, like, okay, now be even-handed, you need to demolish more of the illegal Palestinian homes. The problem is when Israel wants to demolish these Palestinian homes, of course, there's an international uproar. Nobody outside of Israel and outside of the far right in Israel cared when a few Jewish homes were demolished on Friday. But if Israel's going to go demolish, for example, Khan al-Ahmar, which is this like Bedouin village built illegally, people are going to freak out around the world. It's become this sort of cause celeb. And part of the reason that it wasn't demolished, because actually the Supreme Court ordered that it should be demolished years ago, is because Angela Merkel was going to visit Israel, and this was supposed to happen like 2 days before she was going to visit Israel. And she basically called Netanyahu and was like, if you demolish this village, I'm not visiting, and I'm going to make a big fuss about it. It's been years. Obviously, Angela Merkel's not Chancellor of Germany anymore. It's been years since that happened, but that village still stands. And people on the Israeli right view Khan al-Ahmar as this like symbol of how the law is not being enforced evenly. And so, people who read about Israel in the, again, general media think that the law is being enforced unevenly and favoring Jews or favoring Israelis. But in this case, it's uneven, favoring the Palestinians. So I think going forward, this is something that the debate is ongoing now in the government. It's really something since Friday. It's very fresh. But it was sort of inevitable that this would happen because it's building on something that's been going on for years and years in Israel. So it'll be interesting to see how this government works it out, because, again, this is a homogeneously right-wing government. Netanyahu is reliant on his coalition partners, and so they're going to have to come up with some sort of solution how to not have the government collapse, but also to figure out these different issues. So those are the big things on the agenda with this new government, and I'm going to look at your questions now.
Well, thank you, first of all, Lahav, for addressing
Yes.
a few very interesting topics, and I think that about each subject you just mentioned, we could talk for hours and hours and hours and go into depth. But of course, tonight was a perfect way to give an overview of the most pressing topics at the moment in Israeli politics. The first question asked in the Q&A box is in the context of US Israeli relations, which have always been good in general. Do you expect that the US administration will pressure the Israeli government against the plans for reforming the judicial system?
So there's already some talk. The US ambassador in Israel has said a couple things, and the US National Security Advisor was in Israel last week, and that also came up between him, that's Jake Sullivan, and Netanyahu. Reportedly, Netanyahu told Sullivan that the end result will be more moderate, that what's now proposed in the Knesset is not what's going to be ultimately, which would fit with what I had said, which is that's the normal legislative process where people discuss things and they meet somewhere in the middle. So clearly Netanyahu thinks that that's going to happen as well, except that that's not what he's saying in public, right? In public, he's just fully supporting his justice minister. So it's all politics. I think that there will be, because I think that ultimately the judicial reform will be more moderate than what was presented by the government. I don't think that that's going to be the big drama between the US and Israel. I do think the fact that this is a government that is so pro-settlement, I think that's going to be the huge source of tension, because even in the Bennett-Lapid government, which couldn't do very much on that front because they were a government, a very heterogeneous government that had a lot of different views on the matter, there was still a lot of pressure from the US. So in this government, where they're all about building, they've only been around for a month, so they haven't really done much yet, but in general, they're pro-building. I think the pressure will be much greater.
All right, thank you. Now I'd like to combine a few questions from the Q&A box. There are a couple of people who are talking about, of course, Aryeh Deri, who has, as you said at the beginning of your lecture, has been fired by Netanyahu after the High Court ruling. His party, Shas party, has relatively many seats in the government, relatively. And the question therefore is, what do you expect that is going to happen between Deri and Netanyahu? And are you able to perhaps see something about a cabinet crisis and a shorter shelf life of this government because of this internal crisis between Deri at one hand and maybe Netanyahu at the other hand?
So the day before and like the morning before the verdict was given on Deri, there were different people in Shas saying that if Deri is not in the government, there is no government, right? Which you would believe that Shas is leaving and that we're going to have another election. But ultimately what has happened is that Deri has had to resign, or was fired because he didn't want to be the one who resigned. And that two Shas Knesset members are taking over his two ministries. And that they're trying to find a legal solution, trying to pass some sort of law, change the law so that Deri can become a minister again. I think that they'll find it. I mean, clearly this is a government that doesn't have any qualms about passing laws that challenge or contradict what the court said. So I think moving forward, that's what they will try to do. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that will, at least for a few months, keep things together a little bit longer. And as long as the Deri can maintain some sort of power base, I don't think that that's going to be the thing that'll bring the government down. Because even though they were threatening, they immediately backed down from those threats.
Okay, and what about Netanyahu himself? Being still under a sort of, well, suspicion of breaking the law. And he has, of course, been elected as the new prime minister. What is his situation, and will he be in danger of any court rulings in the future?
Yeah, it's a process that'll take years. I mean, the trial's not over, and it's multiple trials, but even if he's convicted, he can appeal to the Supreme Court. And so it's going to take a really long time. So there's no chance, I think, even in this term as prime minister, that like he would be convicted and have to leave. And politically, it's had a huge effect. On the one hand, the right doesn't, I mean, I don't know if they don't care, but it hasn't deterred them from voting for Netanyahu or for Likud or for parties that support Netanyahu. The law allows someone who's under indictment to continue to be prime minister, and they're continuing to support him. And the indictment came down in early 2009, in early 2020, right? When we were in the middle of this whole multiple election cycle, and it didn't give Netanyahu any fewer votes. On the other hand, you have parties in the center of the political map, especially like Benny Gantz's party, who they won't sit in a coalition with him because he's under indictment. And they say that explicitly. They think it's not appropriate, even if it's legal, that someone who is charged with a crime can be prime minister. And so in theory, had he not had criminal proceedings going on, then this whole political crisis that Israel has been in for the past few years might not have happened. And that would just change the political map of possibilities.
And we still have seen that regardless of these suspicions, he's still very popular in Israel.
Yes,
many
yeah,
people.
Exactly. That's what I was saying, that people on the right didn't change their vote over that.
No, he does seem to have a very, very loyal core of voters electing him time after time. We, of course, also know that Netanyahu is let's say, he is very good in establishing international relations. His English is flawless, and he is also known for his good contacts, for instance, with AIPAC in the United States. Do you have any idea about the position of these Jewish organizations in the US regarding the plans to change the law of return?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which Jewish organization, but for the most part, most US Jewry is not Orthodox and doesn't keep the Orthodox definition of who is a Jew, even though that's what the rabbinate in Israel believes. But the law of return allowed people to immigrate to Israel as Jews, even though they were not considered Jewish once they arrived in Israel, which is a sort of strange situation. The US Jewish organizations oppose changes to what's called the grandfather clause, which is to say that if you have one Jewish grandfather, you can still make Aliyah, even though you're not considered Jewish by Orthodox Jewish law. So, the intermarriage rate in the US is very high. Half of all Jews marry non-Jews, maybe even more at this point. And people really, the organizations do really oppose that change, because they say, if our grandchildren are not going to be considered Jewish, then that would really affect the way we would look at Israel and our connection to Israel. At the moment, it's mostly impacting Jews from the former Soviet Union, not so much American Jews. But, the demographics of the US Jewry are such that it would affect them eventually.
Do you think that it has anything to do with the fact that it does affect the former Soviet Jewry the most?
Does what have to do with it?
Now, my question is, do you think that because that there is some willingness within some members of the government to prevent more former Soviet Jews to come to Israel because of this
No,
unclearness with grandfathers or the
no,
Jewish
I don't
line?
think so. Because I don't think the people who are advocating it, I think that their issue is really like they don't want they don't want like mass immigration by people who are not Jewish in their eyes. I don't think it's about where they come from. I mean, it happens to be, right, because there's a war going on right now that people from the former Soviet Union are the ones who immigrate to Israel the most. I mean, it was like that before the war as well, but there's a spike in it because of the war. But I don't think that the concern is that there are too many Russian speakers in Israel. I think the concern is that they're not Jewish.
Okay, let's get back to the judicial reforms for a second. I read a very interesting article today about the proposed reforms of the Supreme Court, which you have spoken about in a very clear way. You have mentioned it already a bit, but if an institution, so the Supreme Court, which is an institution that is not elected, as you said, if they have so much influence over laws being passed by an institution that is actually chosen by the people, isn't this reform actually a very good reform in terms of the democratic character of Israel?
I mean, that's the argument that people who are in favor of the judicial reform make, that they're saying that there should be better representation of the views of the voting majority, right? And so the feeling is that the activist judges are from the left and that the non-activist judges are from the right, and that it's very hard and rarely happens that someone from the right gets on the court, and so it should be more even-handed. You know, I think it's a fair argument.
All right.
It's a reasonable argument, you know, and it's a political issue right now in Israel.
Yeah, it has been politicized.
Yeah.
And what about Lapid, who today went to see President Herzog and talked about committees to be installed to counterbalance or to bring more nuance into the judicial reforms. What are your views on Lapid's idea and the possibility of them succeeding?
So at first I was like, oh, this is what I've been talking about, right? As I mentioned in speaking to you, you know, that I've sort of criticized the opposition not wanting to work within the system, right, to change the reform. And I said, oh, he wants to work within the system. But as it turns out, what he wants is for the president to convince Netanyahu to back down for the reform and not to work in the Knesset committees, which, so again, I don't know how effective that's actually going to be. I mean, I think that Netanyahu respects Herzog and will meet with him and will hear him out, but I mean, it's possible, but I don't think that that's like the most effective path to creating change. I mean, what you want is, you know, you have a text and you want to sit on the details of the text and make changes to it. And there is already a committee in which to do that. It's called the Knesset Constitution Committee, and it's meeting every day to work on this bill.
All right. Thank you very much, Lahav.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for giving us a very interesting lecture about topics that are controversial at the moment, to say the least. And also, I would like to thank the public for joining us today and also for writing interesting questions in our Q&A box. Yeah, this is it. I would like to wish everybody a very good night.
If I could just add,
yes, of course.
People can follow me on Twitter and I try to answer people's questions there if they have them, or I'll write it in the Q&A box. Can I write something there? No, I can't. Okay, it's at Lahav Harkov. Yeah, just feel free to be in touch there.
All right, great, Lahav. Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.